Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us today. I'm happy to be part of this session. I'm a member of WAPPP, of course, but also of the COP27, the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. And my colleague Andrew Koolsbergen is a senior vice president. He's going to give you a good insight into what all the great work that organization does and how we're working together to further the PPP mandate. And also in the not too distant future too, we're looking at working closely together with WAPP as well. So without any further ado, happy to have you here, Andrew. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Wayne. It's great to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. So as I mentioned, my name is Andrew Koolsbergen. I'm with the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. We're a Canadian organization, obviously. We've been around for about 30 years. And so for today, what I want to do is I just want to talk about the organization, where we started, what we do, where we're going, and then just some of the great events that we do throughout the year. And then answer any questions that you might have about the organization or about membership in the organization and the benefits that we offer. So the Canadian Council was formed 30 years ago. We started more or less as a conference organization. We hold an annual conference in November, and that's what started the council. The apparatus around the conference created what we do now. Our focus is we're a very interesting industry association because we have members that are both the private sector and the public sector. We don't do any lobbying on specific projects. We don't do any lobbying to government. But we do advocacy work, and we do a lot of facilitation of dialogue between both the public and the private sector. And so it puts us at a really unique crossroads across the country because we're sort of a one-stop shop for if you're looking to be involved in the P3 sector in Canada. The council is where sort of everyone hangs out. So we're, like I said, we've been around for about 30 years. And a lot of our activity is obviously focused on the conference. We do a conference every year. It's a major one, 1,200 people coming to Toronto for it. But we also do a lot of other work as well. So, some of the activities, we're heavily involved in research. There's a lot of research that we do. Every year we do 3 case studies on P3 projects across Canada. These are all available for free on our website if you have an interest in going and reading about some Canadian projects. But we also have other research underway, and you'll see some more of that coming out in the next couple of months. And we're always really keen to work with our partners to further advocate for the P3 model in Canada. Where we've been, I mean, the P3 model's obviously evolved heavily in Canada over the past 30 years. So we know when the council began, it was a large task of ours was introducing the P3 model to Canada. It was a fairly foreign concept. Obviously there was a lot of rhetoric around it, and a large focus of the beginnings of the organization were just bringing the P3 model into Canada. 30 years later, we've certainly succeeded. Along with our members, the Canadian P3 model is one of the best in the world. We have over 300 projects underway and completed in Canada. And it's a real testament to just the sector and the ability of the Canadian market to introduce this model and be so successful in it. A lot of what we do now, as a result of the mandate of introducing the model, is more or less complete. A lot of the work that the council does now is focused on facilitating dialogue between the sectors as they deal with changes in the model. There's been obviously a lot of pressure on sort of your traditional P3 model versus a progressive or alliance model in the last several years. And so the council plays a big role in helping both the government, the client side, and the private side just sort of navigate the changes in the model, the changes in the sector, different challenges that we're facing, everything from a risk balance. And certainly now with the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of capacity issues and the ability to deliver projects for lump sum contracts. So it's an interesting market, and the council basically plays a facilitator role in making sure that both sides are talking. And so that partnership aspect of the P3 continues strong in Canada. And anybody who's worked in these projects understands that, if the partnership falls apart, I mean, the contract doesn't last much longer after that. So we're very proud of that role that we play in that market. Some of the other things that we do, we hold many events throughout the year. Events is a significant component of our activities, and we're always keen to get more people out and involved. The key event that we hold, obviously, is our conference. We hold it in November. Like I said, it's about 1,200 people that come out to this event. It's the entirety of the Canadian P3 infrastructure sector. And it's a fantastic event. I highly recommend, if anybody here has any interest in learning more about it or attending. It's a 2-day event happening from November 21st to 22nd. We also have a special third day, an International Delegates Day, where if you're an international delegate coming in, we encourage you to attend this day, because we actually have some of the representatives from the agencies across Canada doing a speaking panel, and then also some tours of P3 projects in the Toronto area. So it's a fantastic event. I cannot recommend it enough. Obviously, heavily involved in it. And that's, one of our major events, but we also do other activities and events throughout the year. A lot of what the council does, like I said, is facilitating dialogue. But we also facilitate a lot of people who are entering the market and are looking to connect with other players that are not necessarily in their industry, but they're looking to join a consortium. And they may know, if you're an engineering firm, you may know other engineering firms, but you need to be able to talk to contractors and law firms. And so people use our events for that quite often. It's a great place to network. I'll give you an example. We had an event just several weeks ago here in Toronto, and multiple times we heard conversations of, I hear you're building something. We should build something together. And, people go off into a corner, and a lot of good comes out of this. So the council loves that role of, helping facilitate the private sector to be able to speak to each other, and in that environment that is just conducive to forming those consortiums and getting projects built. We also do a lot of work with the government side. We're very fortunate. We have very sound support from Canadian governments across the country, from the provinces, from our federal government, and we also have large municipalities that are also members of our organization and are actively participating. And one of the fun things that we get to do is, quite often, a common refrain is the private sector wanting something to be heard at the public sector side, wanting the client to know, some of the challenges, some of the issues that they're facing. And quite often the client side is looking for that information as well. So we quite often get governments from across the country will approach us and ask us to set up meetings with our members or give advice to the government based off of what we're hearing from members on how governments can go about ensuring that their major infrastructure procurements are going to move smoothly and have enough bids and be well received by the sector. So a lot of our activities and our events focus on that. We are a pan-Canadian organization. We deal with every province across the country. And as a result, we do events across the country as well. We did an event in British Columbia this spring, focusing on how P3s can be used to fight climate change, and how the private sector is a key player in that. We did an event in Calgary where we talked about the municipal wastewater challenges and the opportunities that we find in that sector. And as we go into the fall, we'll have a few more events that we'll announce in the coming weeks and the coming months. So please make sure you stay tuned for those, because we do a lot of really great events right across the country. But ultimately, our conference in Toronto is the major one. In terms of the council itself, we're a member-based organization. We do exclusive events just for council members. Every month, with a small break in the summer and one around the conference. But every month we do a candid conversation. These are very interesting. They're just an hour-long session. We bring in members or people that we've been working with, and we basically just have a conversation about a topic that we're working on at the time. It could be research that we're focused on. It could be an issue that we're facing in the market right now. An example of the last candid conversation we did, we had some of our members come in and talk about the labor capacity issues and the inflationary issues that we're facing in Canada and around the world today in building infrastructure. And these are great events because it's a great opportunity for our members to come together with everyone else that's part of the organization, hear from a speaker, ask questions, and just be able to be in tune with what's going on. And it sort of reflects back again on, the council does represent this sort of one-stop shop that we get, that you get if that's as a member. Is if you're working in the P3 market in Canada, you want to be a member of the council because that is where it all happens. In terms of our thought leadership, so the council obviously plays a significant role in the P3 model and its integrity being preserved in Canada. We do a lot of thought leadership. Quite often we make submissions to both the federal and provincial governments for their budget processes, advocating for increased P3 model use, ensuring that P3 model is treated properly and that it is not altered and has the benefits of a P3 stripped out of it. So there's a lot of thought leadership, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of events and activities. We're a small organization, but we do an awful lot of work across Canada every year. And we've got some really exciting times coming up ahead of us. Our conference this November 21st and 22nd, it's the 30th anniversary of the conference. It's the first time we're coming back to an in-person conference since the pandemic. So we're very excited. It's a fantastic program. We're going to be addressing a whole host of issues. We're going to be focusing on issues such as energy, labor capacity in the market, model choice, by which model are public sector agencies choosing and why are they choosing it. We're going to have a whole bunch of other breakout sessions, everything from retrofits to aviation to broadband. There's a very, very fulsome program put together for this, and we're always very excited to put together content that drives people into the conference. Obviously, networking is a big aspect of this, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that our content that people come in for is fantastic. And I can promise you, as somebody who's working on it every day now, it's going to be a really, really great event, and I can't encourage you more enough to come on board and check it out. Apart from that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have on the Q&A tab. It's one of those things where it's a presentation on the council. Happy to answer any questions you might have on the council or on member benefits or some of the activities that we do, or any questions about the conference. And I'll wait for some questions to pop up, hopefully from some participants if you have any questions. And maybe in the interim, I'll just run through some of the other member benefits that you can get if you decide to join the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. I think we have Wayne coming on here briefly. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we've got some good questions, Andrew. Why don't we start off with the first one? Yeah, what's the biggest difference between the implementation of PPPs in Canada versus the US?
That is a great question. There's actually, I'll start off with actually the similarities in the markets before I go into the differences. We have an incredible amount of similarities. A lot of companies operate on both sides of the border, pretty much indiscriminately. Quite often, it's actually something that's a bit of a bother to the public sector side because you're working on a project and you're focused on the Canadian market. You have a focus on a series of players that you want to bid on it. Then the players might say, well, I can just go easily up to the US and bid on this project because there's a lot of activity that moves between Canada and the US. I would say 80% of our major members have had offices in both countries. The big difference, the Canadian market is a bit different than the US. I would say the big difference is the embracing of using a private sector, the private sector delivery, like toll roads would be, I think, a good example. We have toll roads in Canada, but it's not a very popular item in the Canadian market. And there's a lot of great toll roads that are doing excellent jobs, But there's the general population itself has been geared towards a dislike of toll roads. You don't experience that in the U.S. And so the concession model is sometimes a little more accepted in the U.S. versus Canada. Another example of this is, the Americans have a private healthcare system. The Canadians have a public healthcare system. And that's geared Canadians to, a slight aversion sometimes to private delivery of public assets. And it's, Canadians have a natural sometimes dislike of the American system. They see the American healthcare system as, being inferior to theirs. And I think that's where you'll see some of the differences, is that there's a lot of opportunities for sort of just clear cut, straight up P3s in the US, and the Canadian market has those opportunities in it, but there are some sectors that don't have it as great as the US. So it is an interesting, there's some differences in the market, but I'll say this, I mean, the amount of times that I speak with my members and they switch back and forth between the US and Canada, like they're changing their socks. Like they're very, very similar markets. They're very integrated, and our members have done a great job of basically creating a system where they're able to move their assets across the border to do whatever project they want to do.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent question. Specifics, I guess, with governmental sector, Howard is oriented with, there's been positive feedback. What are the particular regulations that help, I guess, in working with the government sector?
Sorry, could you pop the question back up again?
I can actually read it here. People are oriented, it's very people oriented, and it's heard many positive feedback from PPP professionals. Are there any particular regulations that help? This is in the specifics of working with the government sector in Canada.
Yeah, I don't know if there's actually particular regulations that help. The Canadian government sector is fantastic to work with. I would say there's a couple of significant champions in the past 30 years that played a significant role in getting PPPs in Canada up and running. I'll say one of the biggest regulations, and it's actually not a regulation, but the biggest decisions were governments creating specific Crown agencies to run their P3 projects. So in Ontario, we have Infrastructure Ontario, which is a Crown agency. It's a separate entity. It has a CEO, currently headed by Michael Lindsay. And it was a Crown agency whose sole purpose was to bring in P3s and to work the P3 market in Ontario. You have the same thing with, was originally Partnerships BC. It's now Infrastructure BC. Sask Builds is another one. It's the creating of that agency. It's an interesting one when you're not fully in the public service. The agency is sort of a separate division. It allows you to be a little more flexible, a little more fluid, and it allows you to be a little more aggressive. Mm-hmm. And, creating of those agencies had a significant impact. I mean, Ontario wasn't the first market to do it. It was British Columbia, and Ontario, as the size of Ontario, it's a very large province, has the most advanced P3 market in Canada right now. But I would say that, if you had to deal with a ministry that's also focused on dealing with a whole bunch of other items that fall under their mandate, it's difficult to have that P3 conversation. And we've actually seen this. Alberta has recently, they're not creating an agency, but they're actually creating a separate associate deputy minister role purely for the P3s in their province. And so I would say this is like what's been really well done in Canada is governments have recognized that P3s aren't exactly the easiest contract to understand. It falls outside of your traditional procurement. You need to be able to create the pools of individuals that are going to be capable of working with the private sector to get these projects built. And I would say that is what's been a fantastic success in Canada. And that has largely led to the great experiences that I think people have had dealing with the Canadian P3.
Canada is recognized around the world too. I mean, certainly the healthcare sector, probably if you had to look at Infrastructure Ontario, and there's a new hospital now that's a huge hospital, the South Niagara hospital. It's going to be. So yeah, a lot of history there over the last 10, 15 years, and they certainly have a lot of good experience, which is, successful projects. So excellent. Kind of leads into this next question we have. Is there an overall authority that standardized PPPs? So an authority, is there a difference from provincial and federal mandates?
So no, there is no overall authority. I would say there's probably some desires at times for there to be an overall authority. each province also operates differently. It's this point where the provincial markets are large enough that, going into a different province, there's enough business that if there's a slight difference, it's not a massive impact on the company. But there is no standardization. The federal government is an interesting one because the federal government doesn't actually have an agency that's for P3s. The previous administration had created an organization called P3 Canada, where our new CEO actually worked at P3 Canada back in the day. And that was an organization that focused that was heavily focused on P3s. It was their only job. And they spent a lot of time working with municipalities and smaller private public sector entities to help get P3s across the line with advisory services and working to get projects done. That was dissolved with the new administration, and a lot of the authority of that has been sort of split between the Canada Infrastructure Bank, Infrastructure Canada, and Public Services Procurement Canada. So all three of those are heavily involved in P3s. I would say the Canada Infrastructure Bank and Infrastructure Canada are the ones that we deal primarily. I mean, the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank actually sits on the council's board, Aaron Corey.
Yep.
He was the former head of Infrastructure Ontario. So it is a small world. So that, those sort of are federal organizations that provide a lot of direction. But I would say, Infrastructure Ontario and Infrastructure BC are two of the major organizations, and SAS Builds. Those three, they talk to each other. They use the council to talk to each other. Actually, quite often we, those members, they all sit on our board. Some have sat on the board before. Everyone knows each other. But it's not a very heavily regulated market from the federal angle. It is province by province, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the federal infrastructure assets that use the P3 for the build, they're primarily bridges, with a few other asset classes thrown in there. But the bridges is the big one. The Gordie Howe Bridge being built right now as a P3. But apart from that, the vast majority of the P3 model in Canada is used for hospitals. It's used for hospitals. It's used for transit. It's used for wastewater. But hospitals is the big one. And hospitals are run at the provincial level, and each province has a different way of managing their healthcare system, and that's how Confederation works. And so there's not really a lot of opportunity to regulate across the board. It does create maybe some difficulties when you're navigating the market. When you're building hospitals in Ontario and you want to go and build a hospital in BC, there's going to be some changes. There's going to be some differences, but overall, the market's pretty good in terms of just regulation across or standardization across the board.
Yeah, there's good participation too. Like transportation, focus on that. The Eglinton Crosstown project, I was involved in that in the early stages, and actually doing some work for the consortium that won the bid. But that there again, a collaboration between Toronto and the provincial government and the federal to really see, something in Toronto. People that know the history, it's been a long time coming. So it's nice to see that finally coming to fruition, and working on the extension now. So just on the note of authority for regulations, have you ever heard about? I sit on the ISO Mirror Committee for FM standards. So International Standards Organization for Development of Standards. Any talk about for something as far as development of an ISO standard relative to PPPs, or maybe components?
We haven't really dealt with that much. I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's sort of this interesting bit though. Particularly the Ontario market, when you deal with companies raising something like a standardization like that, or finding like a standard. These companies are so busy, and the client side is so busy building stuff right now that they actually don't have the time and capacity to do it, right? There's not like a need. I think there's not a lot of problems that have been run into. There's a few problems here and there. Obviously, there always is, but I would say that there hasn't been a catalyst to go and create that. And I mean, for us as a council, we're a small organization, and we're always very, very busy. So we're always keen to, try and find things to do, but knowing full well that we only have so much capacity, right? But as far as I know, I mean, my CEO might have a better insight into that, but as far as I know, I've not heard of anything along those lines, but it's always something interesting to explore.
Sure. Okay. What's our next question? Canadian investors, which countries and types of sectors do you think we are heading? What are the key features they are looking for? So kind of trends moving forward as far as certain sectors or countries for
In terms
Canadian
of investors.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I mean, Canadian investors, it's interesting. I mean, we have a lot of the Canadian pension funds are big spenders in terms of the investors. It's interesting. I would say airports is one that I hear quite often. You're seeing a lot of Canadian companies building airports, looking to buy airports, or investors looking to buy airports. Aviation's a really, really big sector that I think the Canadian market's interested in right now. But there's also a lot of ESG driving it as well. You know, the Canadian market is keen to introduce ESG measures into a lot of what they're investing. But again, you know, there's the standard asset classes that the Canadian market loves to build. We love to build hospitals. We love to build highways, and I mean, I think there's an appetite to build aviation assets as well. You know, there's a lot of transportation, transit work at home right now in Canada. There's massive suites of projects being built across the country. I think so. I don't think there'll be an appetite for Canadian companies to go build transit anywhere else right now, or for investors to go and invest in transit elsewhere, apart from maybe toll roads, just because there's not many toll roads for sale or roads for sale in Canada. But I would say if I was to pick one asset that I hear quite often from my members, both from the investor side and the contractor side and the developer side, it's airport assets for sure.
Okay. Yeah, WAPP has a separate, as you know, we've mentioned before, a separate chapter that deals just with that, you know, that sort of sector. And it's very, very much active. Okay. Next question. Does Canada use standard screening and selection process of projects for PPPs? How do we integrate climate targets in the PPP policies and PPP projects? Great question.
Great question. Two-part. I'll start with the one part first. So there's not like there are formal screens. Again, it's not across the country. It's agency by agency. In terms of you know, whether or not this becomes a P3 project. That screen used to be sitting up at more of the $100 million level. It's usually at about the $50 million level now, but we've actually seen even smaller projects than that start to get caught in that. I'd say this: the federal government is very, very good at putting a screen on projects. And in making sure that, you know, whatever they pursue and what they end up going with, the P3 model has been looked at thoroughly as an option. The problem is that the federal government, again, builds very few infrastructure assets that use P3, such as they use bridges, and that's, you know, they have a few others in there. The provinces have screens. I mean, you know, it's one of those things though, where after about 15, 20 years, you know, it's understood if Ontario is going to build a hospital, there's no screen of whether or not we use a P3. It's a P3 is used, right? Because it is, you know, proven very successful in the market. So, you know, there's no formal screen across the board. I would say some of the provincial agencies have a form of screening that's over on the actual ministry side as opposed to the agency side. It's complicated. I apologize for the jumping between the two terms. But yeah, there's not like a formal screen process across the board in Canada. It is definitely agency by agency, and it depends on how much the ministry is planning on integrating the P3s into their mandate. I mean, depending on a government that's in power in each individual province, you could have a government that's not ideologically in agreement with the P3 model. And in those times, you may have a P3 agency operating in that province, but if the political side is not endorsing of it, regardless of a screen, you will have less projects ending up in the P3 bucket. As a whole, I think we've seen, even in sometimes when you've had governments that have not been ideologically supportive of P3s, there's still P3s that get through, which is, you know, for us, it showcases how valuable the model is that even when you might be opposed to it ideologically, you cannot refute the economic benefits, the financial benefits, the innovative benefits. So there's, you know, that's my answer to that part of the question, which actually leads me into, from the innovation side, into the climate change side. There's been some really interesting work on integrating climate targets into P3 projects. One, and I encourage you to go onto our website and look up, because we actually have a case study on this. It's the Talicho All-Season Road. So this was a road in the Northwest Territories. It's Canadian far, far north. And it was a all-season road. Previously, the communities that it served, they were served by an ice road, so you could use it for a couple of months in the winter, and that was it. After that, it was just airlift everything in. Obviously, terrible for the environment to be flying in diesel fuel to run these communities. But the Talicho All-Season Road was one of the first projects in Canada, and it's built by Kiewit, to actually integrate climate change into the risk of the road. So the company was tasked with ensuring that, as the permafrost does begin to melt, there's a change in the terrain up north, and that will have an effect on the road in 30 years. And the company was assigned with taking the risk of ensuring that road would last the 30 years with that climate change risk built in. So I think we've already seen some really unique examples of how the P3 model is inherently ideal for combating, the effects of climate change. But we also have had conversations about, it's not so much combating just the effects of climate change, but also helping fight and prevent climate change to start. It's two sides of the equation, right? We need to build resilient infrastructure, but we also need to build infrastructure that has innovations in it that matter, and that actually have a significant impact. And I think, again, here, like I mentioned earlier, we did an event in British Columbia in the spring talking just about this. How is the P3 model suited to fight climate change and prevent climate change? And people were saying, unleashing the innovative ability of the private sector is how you will fight climate change. Governments can give the mandate, but at the end of the day, it's the private companies that are going to go and find the solutions that are really going to have significant impacts. And the P3 model represents a very unique vehicle that is kind of difficult to find anywhere else, in which you can allow the private sector to sort of unleash itself. And, as long as you're giving them a nice broad scope and they can have room to work, you're going to have some excellent projects. And we actually had a fascinating example that was given. We had a speaker at that event, and she had raised the fact. She says, green roofs are an example. We had a lot of, sort of traditional contracts that were asking for green roofs because it was environmentally friendly. It helped retain, the heat into the building. And she said, this is great, except when we actually looked at it, you had to go and you had to do a bunch of waterproofing on that roof. That was a lot more expensive. You had to use a significantly higher grade and more steel in order to support that sort of activity. There's like a watering aspect. And she said, when we actually looked at it from a private sector side of view, there was actually not a whole lot of environmental benefits. And in fact, it almost became a negative benefit from the amount of work and effort and money that we had to put into it. So it's just an interesting situation where it was, if you were to ask me before that event, if you were to ask me, are green roofs good for the environment? I would say, yeah, like it kind of makes sense, right? And I think generally people think that makes sense, but it took a private sector company to go in and actually look at it themselves to say, actually, what's actually happening here? And I think that's how integrating climate goals into P3 contracts is so important, because it allows the private sector to go and just sort of unleash themselves and actually find the real solutions, the concrete solutions that are going to help us fight climate change. And so I think it's a very exciting avenue that we're going down, and the council's, we're working heavily on this because we want to be really involved. But yeah, there's lots of examples of this. Really
That's a great insight. Do you have conveniently the link to that case study you mentioned and for that road in Northwest Territories?
I can probably find it's on our website under research.
Under research, okay. I'll find it and put it on.
You'll find it. Yeah, I've got this on full screen.
No worries. Next question. Good question. This is from my fellow committee member for WAPP at the North American Leadership Committee, Lori. What are some of the key pain points or challenges that your membership faces? Great question as well.
Yeah, great question. We see a lot of, I would say, it changes throughout the years. A couple of years ago, there was an imbalance in the risk transfer. in a lot of P3 projects in Canada. A lot of risk was being transferred over to the private sector. Utilities risk was a huge issue, and rolling stock risk on transit projects. Those are the key pain points a couple of years ago. The pandemic obviously changed everything. I would say the number one issues facing our members right now are capacity and inflation. It's very difficult for these companies to build projects that they quoted several years ago, under conditions where their costs may have increased by 30 or 40%. And we have some people that are, some organizations that are saying that that's their increase in costs. There's also just a capacity problem I think we're facing. We especially here in Ontario, there's a strong drive now for the skilled trades to be increased, and for more immigration focus to make sure that people that have skill sets, that they're not driving cabs, they're working on our projects, they're helping build Canada as they want to, right? And I would say that's a major issue right now. It's just dealing with inflationary costs. For the beginning of the pandemic, it was, how do you deal with the damages of shutting down projects for COVID lockdowns? Mm-hmm. And the sector worked well. They really partnered well, I think, with the government on finding ways and to ensure that those projects were not completely derailed off of this. But I think now we're running into this issue of, can we actually build the projects that our current that the current province have all lined up?
What's typically the lead time on that, Andrew? The lead time for that, because you've got to get with people with requisite training and experience. At varying degrees, depending where they are in that process. But on average, what would be the lead time you're going to be looking at to sort of plan and forecast for that in advance?
To sort of solve the skill trades type issue. I'd say I'm not an expert on this. The Ontario market has had a significant boost in this in the last 18 months, I would say. Okay. It takes a couple of years. It takes 3 to 4 years.
12 months would be the absolute minimum, and that would be very optimal. Yeah.
Just to start, right? And then you have middle management that you need too, right? There's a lot of people that are retiring out of the market right now. So it's a long process. Ontario has $30 billion worth of transit lined up to be built basically over the next 25 years. And, they need the people to build those. And at the same time, companies to also be able to build hospitals and other public infrastructure assets at the same time, right? So there's a lot of work to be done on this, and it's going to require a lot of partnership.
Excellent. Thank you. We're running short on time, so 7 minutes left. Next question. Do you believe the risk transfer we dealt with different from COVID-19 moving forward? And what about innovation risk? Does it deserve a newer approach when compared with the usual risks? Very good question.
Yeah, so I think you're going to see risk balance transfer will be different post-COVID. Everyone's a little more wary. Everyone's willing to take on a little less risk. I think you're seeing governments realizing it very quickly as well. They're breaking up their bigger projects into smaller early works. They're pulling rolling stock sometimes out of transit projects. The risk balance is going to be different, certainly post-COVID. It jolted everyone. It had a profound effect. In terms of the innovation risk, I think that it's ultimately, at the end of the day, partnership matters on this, right? Innovation is fostered by true partnership between the two, and I think that's a risk. If you're looking at innovation as a risk, you might run into trouble, because at the end of the day, I think governments need to be willing to say, here's the result that we want. Go and achieve it. We're not going to tell you how to achieve it.
Well, that's what they're looking for. Any of these bids that I've been involved with, it's always innovation is where you can sort of get an opportunity to differentiate yourself from the competition and come with an innovative solution, and they'll get points for that.
Yeah, and I think that is being put into contracts. I'll say this. I think that a lot of these companies, they all have their own edges, and the government deciding how they weigh those will be important on driving innovation. On the council side, we're always going to be pushing this. We'll have a major general session at our conference in November, solely focused on innovation and how it matters in the private sector and building these projects. But yeah, it's an interesting. It's not quite defined enough yet for me to be able to comment further on it. I would say just it's a tough one to figure out what innovation risk is going to be.
Sure.
But I think if you're focused on allowing the private sector to innovate as much as they possibly can, you're always going to win. Might be a little rocky sometimes,
Yeah,
but
you're looking today or over the next few years, like especially when it comes to technology. But when you're looking at 30 years, that's hard for anybody to forecast. What technology may be great today, or in a 5-year window, what it's going to be beyond that, and how you have to basically, have money in your, in your bid to sort of compensate for what changes are going to have to be made, sometime down the road. So it's a very tough call. Yeah, excellent. Is there a specific policy regarding USPs?
Yes. Again, not standardized across the country. We've had 2 provinces, Ontario and Alberta, have gone into the USPs. Ontario was the first one, and they launched and they had a lot of activity on USPs. We haven't seen any projects come out of that yet, but they've also had a pretty significant election and a change in portfolio for the minister. So there's some, expected delays that come as a result of that. Alberta is very active on the USP front, and I think we've actually got about a handful of projects that are probably well underway to being more fully unveiled to the public. But again, like I said, those are the 2 provinces that are the only 2 provinces in Canada. They're sort of pioneering it. I would say there's probably a lot of difficulty in figuring out the exclusivity and the intellectual rights of what that involves. I think that's the stumbling block that everyone has that problem with USPs. But yeah, there's 2 policies. Both are different. One in Alberta, one in Ontario. Highly recommend checking them out.
Okay, we have one more question, and then we're fortunate that Ziad from WAPPP can join us. He's our president. What makes Canadian institutional investors so different from other countries? Canada was the first to invest in emerging markets and take on the BBB risk. Are there specific policies that makes this easier?
I think it's a combination of a series of factors. The Canadian pension funds are incredibly well managed, and I think that it was a perfect storm of having an enormous amount of capital and the right environment and the right opportunity over the past several decades that made them such excellent investors. I would say this. I mean, there's obviously some items in the Canadian market that you can't buy. Airports cannot be owned by the Canada Pension Investment Board, and I think they may wish they could, but I think that's what pushed Canadian investors to emerging markets, because there was a time when there wasn't maybe a lot of infrastructure to invest in Canada. We have a lot now. But there's also asset classes that exist elsewhere that don't exist in Canada that they can purchase. So I would say it's the Canadian environment of, I can't speak well enough of the pension funds. Like they're just excellently managed. And I think that's why they have the capital to be able to go and do that. And again, we have a strong PPP market here. They understand that. They understand the principles and the policies. They see the benefits, and they're able to go and export that to other countries, and really has some excellent projects as a result.
Excellent. Great. I think we're almost out of time, Jyoti.
Yes, we are. I think the questions will keep on coming. Obviously, you can see all of us have many questions to learn from Canada. It's always been a good practice to learn on the PPP side. We've all used these examples from Canada as international best practices. So really pleasure to have you here, Andrew. I think you've handled our questions really well. We can keep talking to you for hours and hours. So really thank you so much, and Wayne for organizing this, and David, Baxter, and Laurie. So really, to be continued in a way, our partnership between WAPPP and Canada. And with that, I will end this session. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.